Is coming to you live from Tel Aviv this hour. Thanks for joining us. We begin following that announcement on Friday afternoon by Israeli Defense Minister Benny Gantz that 6 prominent Palestinian civil society groups will now be designated terror organizations. The international outcry began, including from the United States. But Israeli defense officials dispute the claims that American officials were not informed in advance of this controversial move by Jerusalem, even insisting that the White House received the relevant intelligence information. Now, the Israeli Defense Ministry issued a statement that all 6 organizations employed senior members of internationally designated terror organizations, such as the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And in practice, as they put it, these nonprofits acted as extensions of the terrorist leadership. And our correspondent, Ariel Levine-Waldman, is in Jerusalem today covering the story here. Ariel, what more can you tell us about this sweeping terror designations and the expected actions by the Israeli government?
Yeah, when we're talking about the terror designation and the extensions of terror groups, we're not simply talking about extensions of the group, but in many ways directly connected to, and in many ways simply serving as the legitimate fronts to bring in funding for these groups. We saw in many cases direct crossover between senior membership in many of these NGOs and senior membership in the Palestinian Popular Liberation Front for the Palestinians, the PFLP. And in all of these cases, we saw crossovers between the membership. We saw very little in the way of bookkeeping when it comes down to how the funds were actually used. And we saw in many cases the hiring of so-called activists to teach events and activities where these activists were nothing more than already convicted murderers for various terror organizations. For slightly more on what sort of crossover we saw between the organizations and the NGOs, we did speak to one of the people involved in writing one of the reports from NGO Monitor, and this is what he had to say.
These officials have, you see on Facebook, you see that they're posted as having been at a memorial for a PFLP martyr who was killed in a clash with the IDF. Or they themselves, there's Samir Arbid, who is now undergoing trial for having been the head and killing basically the Rina Schneider back in August 2019 in a remote detonated bomb when she was hiking with her family. So this goes back a number of years, and we see these connections where you have individuals who are both activists, not activists is one of those, people who were terrorists involved in terrorism on behalf of the PFLP, holding very high-level positions, and also the treasurer or some other very important function, member of the board, head of the board of the same human rights NGOs. It's true for Al-Haq, it's true for Adamir, it's true for the Union of Agricultural Workers Committees, which is a Palestinian framework, a PFLP framework.
And this is what the next question was, what can be done about this? Well, the biggest one that can be done is if you get an international recognition that these groups are acting as money laundering sources or extensions of terror groups, suddenly you have a whole bunch of international banking and financial sanctions that could be leveled against these groups that would really freeze the ability of governments and activists around the world from contributing to the groups. On top of that, it's not simply a matter of legal or economic sanction. There's also the ability to simply point out that these groups have direct crossover. And if you do that, suddenly the donations are going to dry up because not a lot of European governments and activist groups are going to want to be associated with terrorist organizations.
Ariel Levine-Waldman with the breakdown here of this story. Now, the designation of 6 Palestinian NGOs here as terrorist organizations. Thanks for that. But we also are joined by Dr. Kobi Michael right now, Senior Research Fellow for the Institute for National Security Studies and former Deputy Director General of the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs. Thanks for being with us here. First of all, on the cost-benefit analysis of making this kind of move right now, why produce this huge international uproar at this point, all while there appears to be a congruent strategy to lower tensions with the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and even in the Gaza Strip?
Good to be with you. I'm surprised that it has been done just now. I think that this is something that should has been done long before. I don't think that this is something that will awake the Palestinian arena or the international interest in the Palestinian arena. I think that this is something that should be done. These NGOs are a camouflage for laundering money for terror organizations. And exactly as we deal with the laundering money of Hezbollah or Hamas, we have to deal with the same thing with regard to the other terror organizations. And I think that Israel has a very strong case in this regard. I think that Israel is well coordinated with the security establishment in the United States of America. Although we heard that the State Department were not in the picture, but this is something that relates to internal problems in the American administration. And I assume that Israel will have no serious problem with most of the European governments. So I think that this is a right thing that has been done, and it should have been done long before.
Now, as you mentioned, dealing with the European Union, United States, Israeli partners in many endeavors now, who themselves don't want to see their money fall into corrupt hands. I mean, for example, we saw the Swedish Foreign Minister, Linda, here just last week, I believe it was, calling out the corruption within the Palestinian Authority, sitting next to President Abbas in Ramallah, even talking about the hesitance to provide more funds here. Does Israel have partners in the European Union for dealing with these issues? As you mentioned, are they listening?
Yes, of course, they are listening, and even listening carefully. Not all the governments, but I think that the majority of the governments. And just last week, the British government decided to stop the money flow or the financial assistance of the British government to the Palestinian Authority educational system. Okay, and this is something that follows reports and researches that have been conducted by Impact SE and other organizations, as well as the very good job that was done by NGO Monitor with regard to the civil or to civilian NGOs in the Palestinian arena. And I think that Israel has a very good case, and Israel has to stand on its argumentation in this regard. And I think that Israel, along the way, is able to convince most of the governments to be much more cautious with regard to the flow of assistance, financial assistance to the Palestinian Authority and to Palestinian NGOs in the Palestinian arena.
Now, this may complicate the efforts of these Palestinian NGOs, and we've seen efforts, as you just mentioned, with the education system here, going to the European governments, calling out the content in Palestinian textbooks. But those textbooks haven't changed yet. The behavior on the ground yet with the Palestinians hasn't changed yet. Is this just basically aimed at cutting off the funding or producing actual change on the ground? What's it look like?
There are changes. These are very minor changes, and I'm talking about the West Bank. In the Gaza Strip, the situation is much worse. I think that once the money will talk and the Palestinian government, the Palestinian Authority will feel the heavy sanctions or the policy of the Western governments, they will do something in this regard. I'm not so optimistic that they will change it dramatically, okay, from black to white. But I think that even minor changes are welcome. And but unfortunately, I think that even these minor changes are too minor for the time being.
Yes, certainly, as we know, the research and investigations have been done for many years, if not decades at this point, into some of these organizations. Dr. Kobi Michal, thanks for being with us.